Hello, this is Deb Van Dyke Reese, and I'm the director of the Nebraska Court Improvement Project, and I would like to welcome you to our webinar that is focusing on using graduated responses for youth on probation. Amoreena Brady is the Juvenile Justice Specialist and will be our presenter today. Prior to Amoreena getting started, I wanted to do a few housekeeping items. If you have not muted your phone, please make sure that you hit *6 and that will mute your phone. And then also we are recording this webinar, and the webinar will be on our YouTube channel if you would like to refer to it in the future. And then finally, Amoreena will leave some time at the end to answer questions, but if you would like to type your questions in the chat box, we can keep track of those questions, and then she can answer those at the end of the session. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce Amoreena Brady, Juvenile Justice Specialist.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am excited to be doing this webinar, and I thank the Court Improvement Project and their staff for helping me. Also, not just helping me and inviting me to do one, but helping me with technology, because that is not one of my strengths. So I really appreciate all their help, and I definitely appreciate everyone attending today and taking time out of your busy days to take the time and learn a little bit about what we're doing within probation. So I really appreciate that. Just to get started, as Deb said, my name is Amoreena Brady. I office out of the Administrative Office of Courts and Probation. I am a specialist, and my focus is around juvenile justice reform efforts. So I'm really excited about that opportunity, because it's taking what's going on around the country in research papers and best practice and bringing that to Nebraska to better serve the youth and families that are on probation with us. So one of the best practices, as you're going to hear about, is today. It's about how we use incentives and sanctions with youth on probation. So like I said, this is something I am very passionate about, and I know we have a lot of growing to do in this area. We're trying to forward the slide, so just one second. Like I said, technology, not my friend. Okay, now I figured out, so I'll be good from here on out. Okay, so today the goals for today are to understand the benefits of standardizing the approach to positive and negative behaviors for youth on probation, gain knowledge from national experts. So I'm going to reference some papers that have recently been published around juvenile justice and best practices. I highly encourage anyone that's working in this field to go out and read these papers, these articles. They're very informative, and they all talk about best practices, and many of them have similar recommendations in them, but I think then that helps reinforce the fact of how important that is, and all of them do talk about incentives and sanctions with youth as well. And then we're going to look at some research that has been done around using incentives and sanctions with people on probation, and then I will also talk about our newly developed, well, I wouldn't say newly, it's been around, we're implementing now, but our graduated response for incentives and sanctions. We've had sanctions prior to this, but we've added an incentives matrix, and I'll talk about that a little bit more too. So what are graduated responses? If anyone that's participating is a parent, what I would tell you is it's parenting. When you have your child does something well, think about when you potty trained your child. You celebrated and rewarded when they used the restroom when they were supposed to. And then there was discussion and talk about why didn't we go to the bathroom when there was an accident. And so that's pretty much what we're talking about today. We just don't call them in parenting incentives and sanctions. That's what we call them in probation. But it really is built around that parenting model of rewarding good behavior and then addressing behavior that might get them into further trouble. I think the biggest shift for probation is not solely focusing on the negative, but how do we really look at the positives and focus on those positives when some of our youth haven't experienced a lot of reinforcing a positive behavior in their life, whether that be at home or in their educational settings or other settings that they are in. But I think that that's what's really important for us to think about. And we do understand that part of our job is that we have to promote public safety. We have to make sure that the public is safe, and safe means that our youth are making good choices and showing positive behavior over negative behaviors. We also know that we need to hold ourselves accountable to making sure that we're doing what we need to do to work with the youth to have behavior change, but we also need to look at holding the youth accountable. And accountability often can be a negative term, but really this is looking at accountability when they are doing something right and celebrating that and making sure that they know we recognize that, because that can go a long way for our youth. And then when things aren't going right, which we know with kids that often is the case, it can happen and they make mistakes. It's the time of adolescence for mistakes, if anyone remembers their adolescent years. Then we want to be supportive and take more of a coaching aspect than a punitive aspect when we are addressing those behavior transgressions. So we also know we have to treat kids fairly. And what we know within our system is kids know each other and they talk to each other. And if you aren't treating each other fairly, they're going to know that. And then you also lose the ability to really work well with your youth on your caseload. And so having a standardized approach with flexibility to be individualized is the challenge to balance, because we know we have to treat kids fairly, but we also know what brings them into our system is very different for each kid and unique, and we have to find that reason to then help better understand how we can help keep them out of our system in the future. So just a quick overview of kind of the approach is from the beginning. When we start working with youth on probation, we need to start looking at them, working with them to succeed, not just comply. So court orders talk about you cannot do this and you shall not do this and you have to have a curfew and all these things of requirements that they need to do to satisfy their court order. And it's our job in probation to make sure that we support them to be able to do those. But we also need to shift from not just did you do this, but how did you do it? And can this be an eternal behavior change that then keeps you out of the court system in the future? So if curfew and running away is one of the youth challenges, how do we address that using incentives and sanctions? If it's around curfew, and the sanction could be that we have an earlier curfew, or the incentive could be if you come home on time for 2 days, then I will let you have an extended curfew for 30 minutes, and then you can kind of go from there and make it a week and a little bit longer. So just not just compliance, but really about wanting them to succeed. And then know that we're working with you. And so if anyone knows about adolescent development, you know that kids make poor impulsive decisions and their brains are still developing. So we need to anticipate that we're going to have challenges. And if we're doing that upfront planning with our youth and our families, then we have strategies to understand. So when are things bad for you, and what do you tend to do when they go bad? Do you run away, or do you go to use substances? And then when they're going good, what do you like to do? And so finding those things out at the beginning to help plan and hopefully avoid some of the challenges that we could possibly face, or at least be prepared on how to face them best with that youth and family, knowing that stuff up front is going to help us. And then providing ongoing reinforcement. When I say swift, kids have different ideas of time frames. And some of you that are maybe parenting teens now, you might really relate to this, because if you say, you can't go to the movies this weekend because on Monday you didn't do your homework, they're going to probably tell you that was a long time ago and you need to get over it. Because in their mind, they've been good for 4 days. And so why are you holding on to the past? And so really quick responses to both positive and negative behaviors need to be a priority, so that they do associate the consequence, whether that be a positive consequence or a negative consequence, to the behavior that they exhibited. So then that reinforces the fact that, yes, this is great behavior, we want to keep seeing this from you, or no, I need to think of different ways to do this because it's not going to work, it's just going to keep getting me in trouble. But if we have officers that are not responding in a timely manner, and I see my youth maybe 2 weeks later, and I start talking about something they did 2 weeks ago, that's not going to make the connection for them. And then if we have youth that are struggling, we need to help identify effective tools that help them improve their behaviors. So is there someone in their life that we have to pull in on their team to say, this person really they look up to, they're going to listen to them more, or it's a go-to person when they're having bad days, whatever that might be. We definitely need to lean on the people that have been in their life and know them more than we would to be able to help provide some information on how to best support that youth in those good days and in those bad days. So what are the benefits of having graduated response? Would be higher successful completions of probation and lower recidivism, which really that's one of the largest goals for us when it comes to juvenile justice and juvenile probations across the nation, is we want to prevent youth returning to our system, but even more importantly, going into the adult system. So a goal is always, what can we do to help this youth leave probation better than they were, and hopefully make better decisions where they're not entering the adult system. The other thing that we want to see is a reduced use of detention and placement on technical violations. So when we talk about technical violations, these are things such as curfew, not being able to maybe hang out with a certain friend, anything that wouldn't be a new law violation, but it's also, and it's usually always, it's in their court orders, like attend school every day, don't miss school, pass every class. Those are some of the conditions that our youth face when they're on probation. And if you have a youth that maybe they struggle in school and maybe their IEP isn't addressing everything that it needs to, and they can't pass every class, and they're passing all but 2. And so when I say technical violations, that's what I'm talking about. They're not necessarily following their court order the way that they were supposed to, but these are also violations that when you look at things like curfew, most kids miss curfew a time or two in their teenage years. I can admit that I was probably, if my mom was on this webinar with me, she would be probably telling all of you how horrible I was and how I acted out, and look at me, I turned out fine. So I just like to always challenge when I work with probation officers when it's a technical violation and they think that that's the next best step of really what do you hope to get out of that, and is this normal teenage behavior, and just for the nature of them being on probation, we're kind of taking the parenting role away from their parent, because if it was curfew, my mom addressed it by giving me a consequence. Well, oftentimes when kids are on probation, whether their parents would give them a consequence or not, the parents sometimes feel like, well, that's probation's job to give the consequence. So we definitely need to be coaching with the parents around, no, you're still the parent, you're still actively involved, and we're going to go with what you go with as a consequence. But looking at normal teenage behavior is still going to happen. They're still going to miss curfew. They might skip a class or 2, and I don't want to excuse that, because I know that those things can lead to further problems in the future, which is why the sanction's important. But to actually go back to court on a technical violation for something like that is pretty serious when we do have those sanctioning options. Consistency and equity, like I said, kids want to be heard and they want to be treated fair. And so oftentimes we talk with officers about how do they allow youth to pick an appropriate sanction. So giving them a couple of options of what sanction you might be thinking of, and then asking them, what do you think would work best where you won't do this behavior again? And generally that usually means we're going to get more buy-in from the youth, and we're going to actually see the youth complete that sanction successfully. And around incentives, we want to find out what motivates them. If maybe it's an extra curfew, but maybe they don't care about that because their parents have a pretty lax curfew. Maybe it's talking to their parents about giving them an extra hour on their Xbox or whatever that might be for them. So we have to find the good things that they like as well, so that we can use those to help give it appropriate incentives instead of one that might not be important to them. And then the next thing is that long-term behavior change. Adolescent is one of the bigger times when your brain is flexible and growing, and they take risks. And we all can remember taking risks. Some of us just took positive risks, like running for student body president, trying out for cheerleading, maybe going out for drama. Those are all risks, and they kind of do the same thing as some of the youth on probation do with their negative risks, that they get that adrenaline going. And so we have to look at how can we allow them safe spaces to make mistakes, to learn and grow from their mistakes, and then support their positive choices that they're making. And that's what we want to achieve while they're on probation. So that's the benefits. It just gives us more tools as a probation officer to really help work with the youth and family and be effective. So, who are the national experts in juvenile justice, and what do they say? So one of the articles I'm going to talk about or kind of reference is there's 4 that I talk about today. Center for Juvenile Justice Reform at Georgetown, and Shay Bilchuk, he's the director there. He has been to our state a few times and presented at NJJA. He's been, if you're from the crossover site, he's been out and worked with our crossover site team members. So some of you might know him. The Council of State Governments is also another one. So you might hear CSG, and they came to Nebraska it's probably been about 4.5, 5 years now, and they did a system assessment on juvenile justice reform efforts and gave us some recommendations, and we update that action plan from the recommendations on our probation intranet page through the Supreme Court website. So if you're interested in how we're doing with those recommendations, it's there as well. And then the Robert F. Kennedy National Resource Center for Juvenile Justice is another agency the agency that comes in and they do probation system assessments. And they did one last year in Lancaster County specifically, and they made some recommendations, and we're working with all stakeholders to implement those as well. And then the Annie Casey Foundation. So some of you might also be from what you might hear as the Juvenile Detention Alternative Initiative site. If you are from that, then you understand what I'm talking about. But the Annie Casey Foundation had historically looked at a lot of front-end work around how do we keep youth out of detention that don't need to be there, or the ones, and identifying the ones that maybe would be best there for the public safety and for their risk to flee the court. And then now they're kind of shifting to do some also deep end work. So I'm going to talk about their article as well. So with the Council of State Governments, their article came out in 2018, and they partnered with Georgetown, so the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform, and they talk about addressing noncompliance behavior through graduated response rather than filing those technical violations like I talked about earlier. And really it says that you should look at a continuum of appropriate graduated responses to help work with that family. That how does the family limit some privileges? How do they increase those rewards? Again, I kind of talked about this as being really it's about parenting. And sometimes with our youth that we work with, we might have a family that maybe parenting skills hadn't been taught to them, because we also know our parenting skills usually come from our parents. And so they might not have the skills, and their youth might have not learned that because they weren't provided that to their family. So really we have to think of us as role modeling behavior for our parents that we're working with as well at times. And so how do we work at that? Graduated response systems ensure that you have that swift, certain consistency. So really, we talk about not ramping up a sanction or an incentive every time. So let me give you a quick example of that. If a youth skips school and I give a response, and then they go to school for a whole month, and then they decide to skip school again, it doesn't mean my response has to get more severe. It just means, hey, it worked for a month, let me try that response again. And so sometimes people think of that 3 strikes and you're out rule, and that's not anything that we think about or have that philosophy within probation, because every kid is different, and some of them are going to take more time, more guidance, and more intervention to help them get back on the right path. We want to make sure that we're reducing recidivism and that we can avoid having those Sorry, I think somebody joined and might need to mute their speakers, so press *6 or mute on your phone. Thank you. So holding people or it's important to hold youth accountable, but again, also important to make sure we're focusing on those positive behaviors as well. So that was one of the, and you see in here the article, how it talks about it in their language. I just kind of summarized that. So then the Robert F. Kennedy Foundation, they do talk about, they have a probation system review guide, and where you see the blue highlighted, it talks about a continuum of graduated levels of supervision and responses to behavior transgressions, and then monitoring what is integrated with effective behavior change, including what services are we using, what programs do we put a youth into based off of risk level. And so when they look at this, they look at how are we doing with using incentives and sanctions. So when Robert F. Kennedy was here in Lancaster County, we took the opportunity to provide them all of our new graduated response matrix information, our old sanctioning options that we had, and we asked them for feedback. As a part of that system assessment, they also had the National Juvenile Defender Center looking at our graduated response as well. So I really am pleased and happy that they were able to give us feedback, because not often does a state system or a county system have the opportunity to have national experts looking at their product to provide them good, honest feedback on what they see and what they know works best for youth. And our feedback was very positive and very unique, because our graduated response actually is very different than any other systems that I've researched. So, and we'll talk about that when we get straight into our actual matrix. So then Casey Foundation, they had a paper that was recently published in 2018 as well. And it talks about, instead of focusing on rules and relying solely on primarily on those threats of violation or sanctions, to minimize those non-compliance, that case management should be driven by incentives, encouraging positive behavior, promoting meaningful personal growth by offering opportunities and rewards for youth. So this might not be a popular subject for everyone, because I do understand how some people might have the view of this youth isn't on probation. Why are we giving them something when they've done something wrong? But the reality is several of our youth have never really experienced a lot of success. Like I said, some of them have struggled in school since grade school, continue to struggle, and now they've come under the court supervision. And knowing that our system has done a pretty good job at doing some interventions with diversions across the state, community-based interventions, school-based interventions, that by the time they come to the court, they've gone through a couple of systems usually, and the court's not the first time that they've been in front of something for getting in trouble. And so knowing that they've struggled to show success, it's really important for our officers and our system in general to recognize those small successes. And oftentimes, because if you're a functional person, you look at successes in a larger picture of like, okay, you're going to get straight A's for your semester. Well, depending on that usability, then yeah, we should be setting that. But if that usability is, I can't tell a youth that hasn't gone to school in 2 months, you know, next semester your goal is to get straight A's and I'll give you incentive. They already know that that's probably not going to work, and they're not going to be motivated to do it. But if I tell them, hey, if you go to school for a whole week, maybe for the first time it's a whole day without leaving, and I can get an incentive, it might not be a really big incentive, but it could be something, then you would see that behavior start to shift over time. And then you can stretch that out. Okay, so you made it a week. Now you'll get a bigger incentive if you go for 2 weeks. And so that's kind of how we can build on that positive behavior change. And that's why it's important to know what's important to the youth, so we make sure that we're giving them incentives that are meaningful to them. And oftentimes people think of incentives as financial, and fortunately we do have a lot of system partners throughout the state in various counties that do provide some probation districts with some funding for some financial incentives, but we have to be very creative because we do not have funding for that. And so some of the things would be, how do we work with parents to give incentives? Because again, we might be role modeling good parenting for them. And if they took their driver's license away, did they do something to earn that back? If they took their gaming system away, can they earn that back? Can they earn time with a friend that might not be a good influence, but how do we provide structured time for them to hang out in the home where a parent is around and they get to still be friends? Because we know kids rely on their friends. So those are kind of things to think about around how do we focus on those positive behaviors, even if they might be small, and build them to get them to longer term behavior change. And then we want to look at how do we, if someone's always telling you you're doing something wrong, it's almost like you're getting beat down all the time. And we don't need that to happen for the youth that we're working with. And so, yes, we do need to address when things are not going well. It's just a matter of how you do that. And it's definitely going to be more effective when you have a relationship with your youth. So talking about how is this sanction? Is it a punitive sanction, or is it something that could help them and actually build them towards healthy development? Some of the examples, when I traveled the state to talk to probation officers about this, and when we talked about some of the sanctions, it was really interesting because they called them sanctions. I'll give you an example of one that I actually love. So a youth was skipping class after their lunch, which was fourth period, and the youth claimed to the probation officer, well, I'm skipping because that teacher doesn't like me and that teacher picks on me. And so the probation officer, being creative, called the teacher and talked to the teacher and said, hey, do you not like so-and-so? And the teacher said, no, I don't even know that child because he never comes to class. And the probation officer said, well, I have an idea. If you're willing to do this and the youth is, do you think this would work? And the teacher said, yes, I'll give it a try. I just want my kids in class to have them have a chance to get education. So the probation officer gave a sanction to the youth that said, you'll go to your fourth period class every day for 30 days, for that month, and you're going to take a selfie with that teacher and you're going to send it to me. So where that is a sanction, it's not a punitive sanction because we already know we want them to go to class. It motivated them because we know kids love selfies and technologies. And then it also created a relationship between that teacher and that student that even after the 30 days was up, the youth was still going to class and they would still randomly send selfies. And not just that student, like other students wanted to get in on it too. So just thinking outside the box and being creative where, yes, it's a consequence, but is it really a consequence? And what can the youth gain from that? So I've mentioned this a couple times about adolescent brain development and their flexibility, but I think it's really important when we're talking about incentives and sanctions that we understand that what research tells us is they're not going to make the same decisions as adults do. They're not fully formed in their impulse and planning ahead and avoiding risk. They actually seek risk, and that makes them feel alive. And so what do we do to help them seek risk in positive ways? And then that emotional regulation is usually not there, and you might recognize that with your own kids as well, with some slamming of the doors if they don't get their way, or whatever it might be. So just knowing that, even with probation's kids, it's the same way. They're not emotionally regulated, and depending on what's happened to them even prior to this, so as they're growing up, if they've been exposed to trauma or that toxic stress where that's ongoing, so domestic violence home, it changes their brain chemistry, which then changes how they develop. So those are things that we have to consider when we are working with our youth and making sure that we're not just snapping to punishment right away. And what are they capable of doing? And if they're capable of it, how do we reward it when they actually do that? And then they're more vulnerable to negative external experiences. I don't know about you, but growing up, if your mom or your parent or someone took you to school, before you'd leave them in grade school, you'd give them a hug and a kiss goodbye, and they'd hand your lunch off, right? And then if they still took you to school in junior high and high school, you're probably like, please drop me off 2 blocks away and let me walk because I don't want anyone to see me with you. So that's just how kids are. They move from really depending on us to being more influenced by their peers. And what we can hope as adults is that our youth, our children, or the youth on probation are picking those good peer influences over those poor peer influences. But we know that peers are influences no matter what. I had positive peers in high school, but I still engaged in risky behavior. But those risk behaviors were those positive risk behaviors, like getting up and doing a speech in front of the whole school, or trying out for the dance team. So those were things that if I hadn't had a good peer group, I might have made choices in other ways that could have affected my future. But we know we can't isolate teens. They need their peers. We just have to hope they're making better decisions. We also see on the news so many times a group of teens making a mistake, and it's usually a big mistake because it's on the news. And I always think to myself, there's no way any of those kids would have went and did that if they were by themselves. There's just no way, because I think of it as myself when I was a kid. If my friend said an idea, I was not likely to be like, no, I'm not going to do that. That sounds like you're going to get in trouble. I might just hesitantly go along with it, and then before you know it, you're wrapped up in it. So those are just things I think of when I see, Juvenile does something on TV. And yes, it's always horrible and horrific, and we hate that, and I don't excuse the behavior, but I also know it's never usually just one kid. It's usually multiple kids because they get together and they group think of a really bad idea. And then showing greater capacity for change. So one of the things about adolescent brain development that I love is that from 0 to 5 is one of the largest times for that neuroplasticity. Well, then their adolescent years is the second largest time. So just because they might be on a troubled path now and not making really great decisions, we have the opportunity to really help them with that brain flexibility and develop better decision-making tools so that they do not continue down the path of making those poor decisions that wind them back up into the court system or even into the jails and prison system, which is ultimately what we all do not want for any of the kids that we work with. And then showing that increase in sensation for seeking behavior, it declines. As you know, there's an age crime curve as well. And as you see age goes up, usually the crime curve goes down. And so they make better decisions, their brains are better developed, and they're thinking a little bit more before acting. They're able to go, okay, if I do this, this is the consequence, and am I willing to take that risk? Whereas before, when I'm 14 and 15, I'm like, that sounds fun. I'm going to do it. And I don't even think about what consequence I could get. I just do it. And then I say, oh man, I'm going to get in a lot of trouble after I've done it. So I think that's really important to think about. As they get older, you should see some development, but you also have to have positive supports in your life working on that development and that identification of how do you attach their behavior to their actions, to their consequences, because that's what's missing and that's what's being developed in their brain until their mid-20s. So if we can help them kind of build those skills and help make those connections earlier, we'll see better choices. I just love this slide because even though I'm not a scientist, I love the whole idea of how do we look at the brain development in the work that we do within probation as well as positive youth development, because we know that naturally kids make mistakes. And so how do we help them grow from that? And what I always look at is youth on probation tend to, just for the nature of being on probation, they get penalized for being normal kids, if that makes sense. So like I said, missing curfew, skipping a class. They get an extra penalty because their parents might put them, give them a consequence. And then probation has to either give them a consequence or reinforce that, or ultimately, if it's the end of the line for them because they've had so many other mistakes and we have to go back in front of the judge, they could get a really big consequence of going to YRTC Geneva or out-of-home placement. And this is for normal teen behavior. So that's what we're kind of trying to shift away from, because we want the ability to keep that out of the court system if we need to, not do those violations, and focus on those positive behavior changes. Okay, so what does research tell us? I don't know if there's research people on the webinar today. If people really love research, or people like, please don't talk about research, it bores me. But I think it's important that we do have to look at research. And really, this research is an adult-focused research, but I think it speaks highly as to even if adults need it, then we know that our youth probably need it even more than adults. So in 2012, American Probation and Parole Association, along with Pew Charitable Trust, and then the National Center for State Courts, did a research on effective probation and parole practices. So this was just about probation and parole in general, not specifically around incentives and sanctions. But what they did find was the use of incentives is equally important and not sufficiently considered when looking at what probation and parole is doing. And I think that means that Agencies, sometimes they see it as a lack of resources to use incentives because everyone kind of jumps to those financial incentives or those tangible incentives when there's lots of ways to give incentives that are outside of that. And then they also, in the past, criminal justice, juvenile justice has really focused around compliance. Like I said in the beginning, we have to shift that and look at succeeding with just being successful in life, not just compliance with your court order. And so if we're looking at that, then we recognize that incentives go a long way. I know as a kid, I appreciated when my mom rewarded me and gave me extra privileges, and I didn't appreciate it when she took stuff away, even though I knew I probably deserved it. So those are things that they saw in this study, as well as sanctions and incentives should be used in conjunction with one another. So it's not one or the other, it's really both. Again, parenting 101, right? When do I tell them they're doing a good job? And then when do I tell them, okay, we need to think about how we do things differently? When you were raising your child, if you're one of those ones that put them in a timeout, did you only use timeout once? I'm probably not. And probably not, I mean, you might have used timeout multiple times for the same behavior because, again, at that, 0 to 5 is when they're growing and their brains are developing, and you have to on-go remind them, like, no, that's not acceptable, or yes, that's excellent, keep doing that. And that's that reinforcement. And we have to think of the kids we work with the same way. And I think that the officers that have demonstrated that, they see more success with the youth that they're working with. So we know that we have some really good outcomes for those kids that are getting those incentives and sanctions, and they're actually being combined together, and the youth feel like they're treated fairly. The other thing, if anyone's ever been trained in motivational interviewing, which our probation system is trained in motivational interviewing, they talk about 4 to 1. So 4 rewards or 4 incentives to every negative or every sanction. And if you think of that, that's a lot to be able to have a youth come to you and say, okay, here's the 4 things you did well, and here's the 1 thing. And so if I'm going to do 2 bad things, I need to come up with 8 good things. That's the gold star standard, which you can see on the slide. But this is where it came from. So that Pew report actually talked about, if you look at the percentage, it's the probability of successful completion of intensive supervision, probation, or parole. So you have at the bottom the ratio of rewards to punishment. So at the very low end, you have about a 9% success rate when you did 1 positive to 10 negatives. That means somebody came to the office and I said to them, good job at coming to your appointment today, but you didn't go to school, you missed curfew, all those negative things that I could pile on them. I'm only going to have a 9% success rate with the people of completing probation. So if you look at the graph, as soon as it shifts from 1 to 2, or from 1 to 2 rewards to 2 to 1, it jumps up significantly from about 20% to almost 40%. So almost doubles just from one positive to 2 negatives to 2 positive to 1 negative. And then once you hit that 4 to 1, 6 to 1, 8 to 1, 10 to 1, you see it kind of level out. You get about 70% to 80%, anywhere in between there. So that's always our goal and our focus is how do we achieve this 4 to 1. And we're not talking about necessarily, like I said, an incentive that's physical. It literally can be, you did a really good job at coming home all week from school on time, and then the fact that you did your homework, and I might actually give you a certificate because you completed a class that I asked you to complete. And then you did the skill that we worked on, and so I'm going to celebrate that skill with you. But some of it's verbal, some of it might be something, but it's just recognizing the fact that that youth did put some effort into follow through with what we're working on. So this study actually talks about the differences, and I think anyone would want to argue that we definitely want to see that higher end successful completion rate than a 9%. Nobody wants 9%. We would not do this work if we thought 9% was good. To not having kids return or being unsuccessful on probation. That's definitely not what we would strive for. So then what else the research pointed out is the importance of them being certain, immediate, fair, appropriate intensity, and then tailored. And I know that we've talked about some of these already, so I'm going to talk about them a little in depth. Sorry, go back one more. So that certain is that they kind of know. They know what the expectation is. Like, I have a conversation with my youth up front and my family around, I understand things aren't going to be perfect. There will be mistakes made. I make mistakes. It's normal behavior to make mistakes. So when mistakes are made, here's what can happen. We have what we call sanctions, and then we'll talk to you and your family about what would be most appropriate. But if you do well, you have incentives so that they know up front that this is an expectation or kind of a part of probation, a natural part of probation, that we're going to celebrate those successes, but we're also going to address those bad decisions. And then I already talked about immediate and fair. So appropriate intensity is if you give the highest sanction for a 15-minute curfew violation, what are you going to do when they miss curfew by 3 hours? Where do you go from there? So when we talk about appropriate intensity, we want to make sure that we're not over punishing or over rewarding, because there's only so many rewards we can do. So I can't say, oh, good job, I'm going to give you a weekend stay at the finest hotel in Omaha, when I might not have the means to do that, but maybe they only came home on time for one night, and would that be appropriate? That's a little too excessive. So really just making sure that you're not over punishing and being mindful with your incentives, that you do have ways that you can keep raising that incentive up. And then tailoring is important, because like I said that before, not every kid responds the same way to a sanction or an incentive. So what works for them might not work for another kid that I'm supervising. So how do I make sure I know those things and then apply the ones that I know will work best? So really it's about saving the most serious responses for those behaviors that are public safety concerns. I kind of, during the training with probation officers, I do talk about, if you have a youth that skips school and you go to their house and they're sitting at home and they were just like, I didn't want to go to school today, it's really not a public safety concern. It's a concern that they're not at school and they should get a sanction. But is that sanction as serious as a kid that might skip school and you get a call from law enforcement and they're found in the park with some cans of paint and maybe someone with them had a weapon? That's more of a public safety concern than the kid that I go to the house and they're literally sitting at home because they didn't want to get out of bed today. So there are going to be sanctions, but they could definitely be different intensity levels of sanctions. We also want to make sure our probation officers have good tools, that they're able to work with our youth effectively. And then lastly, we want to leave that flexibility to work with special cases. So we all know there's cases that come up that they're just once in a lifetime same cases. And how do we work with our team, not just our supervisors, to be creative and flexible on sanctions and incentives that we use? So I'm going to get into ours. And if you look at your top right corner, you'll see under files, there's a graduated response matrix and incentives PDF. And you can access it that way, because on the slide it will be rather small. And so I know that it'll be hard to see. But this is the one that we used for probation. And this is the incentive side. So I'll talk to you a little bit about this. We look at overall risk level from our youth level of service, or our YLS, for anyone that knows what that is. It's our risk assessment to determine their risk to reoffend or return back to our court system. And then we look at several of the areas where they usually see court orders focusing on. So as you see the behaviors all the way from that they haven't had any law enforcement contacts, reduction in their overall risk score is something we look at, completion of treatment, getting involved in a pro-social activity, and then even just successful completion of any of their court-ordered items. And you can see that we have kind of a matrix of from terrific, fantastic to outstanding privileges. And on this, we just recommend these levels, but we're not strict to them. Like, they can kind of choose whatever they have available to them, because really we know incentives is a place where we need to increase our use, and we want to be flexible with this. And if you look at the outstanding level, the last two were actually in the statute 43-286-01, when LB8 passed. This was addition, where it talked about removal of court-ordered conditions or early termination from probation supervision. And the plus is there because we have to make sure we have the court approval before we do this. So if it's something that we want to remove them from their order, we have to ask permission from the court. Or if we think the youth is eligible for early termination, it's another thing that we need to make sure we get permission on. But those are the, I mean, really those top two, those two are the ultimate incentives. Early termination for a youth, especially if someone says you're on probation for a year, again, that's forever in a kid's mind. And if you said, well, look, if we can get some of these things done and you really make some effort, how about we come back and talk about it at that quarter mark, see how we're doing, and then maybe 6 months I can go in front of the judge and we can ask about getting you off probation early, or 3 months early, or whatever that might be. That really can be that carrot that keeps them motivated to make better choices. And so that's on the top level, but then at the bottom, on the lower level, you'll see verbal acknowledgement and praise, and those are things that are important for kids too. I'm going to move to incentives because I want to leave some time for questions, sanctions, because I want to leave some time for questions too. So the sanctioning, I'm not going to even pretend that I can get this trained, because I will tell you, when I trained probation officers in this, it was like, this was more than an hour conversation of the training. But what we look at, this is what's different for sanctions than any other system. And we researched 15 states. We used the problem-solving court incentives and sanctions and the Annie Casey incentives and sanctions kind of workbook on how to build a graduated response system to build this. And so most systems look at overall risk, like our incentives did. And the challenge that we had with that was, we might have a youth that's a higher risk, but maybe they excel in a certain area. Maybe they excel at school. And so when they do something that's a misbehavior at school, then we don't need to target that, because school is a strength for them. Doesn't mean we don't address it, just means it doesn't have to be severe. So on our sanctioning matrix, we actually look at the domain risk of the YLS score. So not just overall risk, but am I high risk in school? Am I high risk in peers? Am I high risk in family? Or am I low risk or moderate? So we kind of take that even more to that next step of being more individual, more targeting on how do we reduce their risk, because we know they have overall risk, but they have these 8 domains, and there are certain domains that really drive their behavior. And if we can target those driving behavior domains, and when they do something in a domain that usually is not a problem area, or it might be a strength, we don't have to come down on that so hard. But if we know this is what's driving their behavior, maybe it's peers, and they're missing curfew because of their peers, then that might be a more severe response, because they are higher risk in that area, and higher risk means they're more likely to stay with us or come back to us. So that's kind of just a nice general quick on how to use this, but you'll see the behaviors. They're something kind of lumped into categories, if we could, around school, unaccounted for time. And these are typically things that we see on court orders that they're not supposed to be doing. And so we have those on there. And then across the next thing over where the sanctions are, you'll see the different domains of the YLS. So this is our risk assessment tool. The only one that is not on there is prior criminal history. That one is one of those static ones that we're not going to be able to kind of change. And so these are the ones that are they're flexible, and we can actually go in and see, can we reduce the risk in these areas. And then across the top, you'll see that minor, intermediate, and serious level, which correlate to how we should think about responding. Now, what you won't see on the bottom there is some of the asterisks in very small letters, but basically it says on the sanctioning side, you cannot use anything above. So if my youth did something and qualified for an intermediate sanction in education and employment, I would need to use one of those, or I could use less. So I could use something from the minor category or their intermediate category, but I cannot go above without a supervisor's approval. Again, we don't want to be too punitive. We don't want to go to that highest level when it might not be something that needs to have that high level response. And so that's the one of the big differences between the incentives and sanctions. We don't have that same philosophy around incentives. You can go above. You can go below or above, but we kind of give this ideal. But with sanctions, you can only go to the actual level, or you can choose something from below, because we also know if it's the first time of a serious violation, we might not want to go to the serious response. We might want to have a discussion around why we shouldn't do that. And then maybe the next time we go to a more serious response. So being flexible to use a lesser response, but just not above that. So that's what it says kind of in the instructions there too. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Oh, at the top, you'll see a bunch of cognitive points around cognitive skill training. What we know is youth need to attain skills. And if we can help them attain skills and practice those skills like a coach again, then they're going to be able to make those better connections and make better choices. And so that's why it's at the top, because it really applies for everything all the way down the category. So if I need a cognitive skill around making better decisions about my peers or making better responses to my family, then I can pull a cognitive skill and how do we practice with them, and then how do we help them go implement that when they're out in real life. And that's something we really talk about focusing on more so than a lot of the other choices, because we know sometimes it's a skill development area that they're lacking, and then if we can develop that, they'll make better decisions. So last thing is we have kind of this 5-level response. This is a nice quick version. There's actually a 12-page guide on graduated responses, and this is part of that guide, but this just really for our officers, but this just talks about when you're going to be sanctioning or giving an incentive to a youth, here's 5 steps to kind of think about in this order. So what's the behavior? What am I sanctioning to? What am I giving an incentive for? What's their risk level, either overall risk or the domain risk? What's the severity? Do they need a high-level incentive or do they need a lower-level sanction? And then how do I individualize that? So what's important for that youth? And then I document it. So making sure that we put the information into our probation management system so that not only that it's documented there, it helps tell the story of the youth while they're on probation, but it also allows us to gather data. So that is pretty much the end of that. And I have about 9 minutes to answer any questions. I'm going to scroll here and see. Right here.
Amoreena?
Yes.
This is Deb, and I just was wondering if you could talk about if juvenile probation has had conversations with the judges or met with the judges to show them this matrix.
Okay, thank you, Deb. So one of the things I failed to mention was in the statute when it passed, there was part of the statute indicates that we had the opportunity to create a new incentives and sanction matrix. So one of the things that we had before was just a sanctioning matrix, and it basically said, here's the behaviors you can sanction to, and then what you can sanction for. So there was no creativity, no flexibility, and unfortunately it was a copy of the adult statute. And what we know is adults and juveniles are different, so we cannot treat youth the same way as we treat our adults. But we had it in statute and it was very prescribed, and we couldn't be flexible. So with LB8 and the help of the JDI statewide committee and Senator Christ at the time, he introduced this bill to say, let probation create a graduated response matrix that includes incentives and sanctions based off of other, best practices, and then the stakeholders have an opportunity to provide feedback. And so for probably about a year, we went around to various statewide committees. I've sent that to all the probation district judges and asked them. I sent it to the probation chiefs. Let me clarify that because that came out wrong. I sent it to the probation chiefs because that's usually our conduit to get information out to their stakeholders, because normally they've had the relationships with their judges, their county attorneys and public defenders. It's not just judges, because it affects county attorneys as well. We usually send our sanctions to our county attorneys because they're the ones that ultimately decide whether they want to file a violation or not. And so really it was given to the probation chiefs to do that, and then I also let them know that I could help and have any kind of conversations that they would want to have. And so I received feedback from various stakeholders, various statewide committees, and I know that the probation chief sent me information back, and we made some adjustments based off of that. So this final version is based off of some of the feedback that we received from that. And I actually do have a document that's probably about a 5-page document that talks about all the different times and people that we showed our graduated response to, the feedback that they gave us, and whether we incorporated that feedback or not. So I hope that helps to answer that question.
Thank you.
And I see, can we get a copy of the PowerPoint? I can definitely get that to CIP, and I'm assuming you could get that out to registration people.
If you give me a minute, I can probably upload it.
Oh, okay. I guess it's going to get uploaded right now. She could work magic in here. Like I said, I don't know how this all works. I'm not great with technology, but okay. So it looks like the PowerPoint's going to be uploaded in a moment. Yeah, that's it.
Okay. There you go.
Okay, it's there. So it should be up in your corner where you found the graduated response matrix. So there you have access to that now. Well, if there's no other questions, I really appreciate your time, you joining and listening to me. I hope that if you're working with probation that you are seeing a good positive shift and people being creative. And if you know that you have access to incentives that would help us, that would be amazing too. I know there are lots of community providers and stakeholders out there supporting probation and the work we're doing, and we appreciate it so much. It's just not consistent across all the districts, unfortunately. So you have, some kids have access to those tangible incentives, which do go a long way. But we also have a lot of probation officers out there using their own money to buy a kid a soda or even take them to grab some McDonald's, and sometimes it's just because they need to eat, but sometimes that's a way to help build a relationship and get them motivated to go to school. So I don't know one of my things I did as I wrap up when I trained this is I said, please share with me a creative incentive or sanction that you've done with youth. And so they openly talked about it, and I don't know how many times I heard of officers spending their own money out of their own pocket to get something for their youth. And so that just speaks volumes to me about the staff that I work with. And I know that that's not always heard or seen by everyone that works with probation. So I know we're trying to do a really good job, and we know the importance of looking at youth and helping them focus on those positive things and not just always being that negative reinforcer that traditionally we probably were known for in the past. So I'm just excited for probation shift. And so hopefully you're seeing that too. And again, I just thank you for attending and have a good day.